Hi lovelies, so welcome back to another story time video, part 3, and we are going to continue with our stories, alright? Okay, so again, I'll start with Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, and we are up to, I'll just take this off. We are up to oh yeah, here we go. Okay, chapter 3 apparently. Feels like we're further than that, but we're only on chapter 3. Okay, chapter 3: A caucus-race and a long tail. They were indeed a queer-looking party that assembled on the bank, the birds with draggled feathers, the animals with their fur clinging close to them, and all dripping wet, cross and uncomfortable. The first question, of course, was how to get dry again. They had a consultation about this, and after a few minutes it seemed quite natural to Alice to find herself talking familiarly with them, as if she had known them all her life. Indeed, she had quite a long argument with the Lorry, who at last turned sulky and would only say, "I'm older than you and must know better," and this Alice would not allow. Without knowing how old it was, and as the Lorry positively refused to tell its age, there was no more to be said. At last the Mouse, who seemed to be a person of some authority among them, called out, "Sit down, all of you, and listen to me. I'll soon make you dry enough." They all sat down at once, in a large ring, with the Mouse in the middle. Alice kept her eyes anxiously fixed on it, for she felt sure she would catch a bad cold if she did not get dry very soon. Said the Mouse, with an important air. "Are you all ready? This is the driest thing I know. Silence all around, if you please." William the Conqueror, whose cause was favoured by the Pope, was soon submitted to by the English, who wanted leaders, and had been of late much accustomed to usurpation and conquest. Edwin and Morcar, the Earls of Mercia and Northumbria. "Ugh!" said the Lorry, with a shiver. "I beg your pardon," said the Mouse, frowning, but very politely. "Did you speak?" "Not I," said the Lorry, hastily. "I thought you did," said the Mouse. "I proceed. Edwin and Morcar, the Earls of Mercia and Northumbria, declared for him, and even Stigand, the patriotic Archbishop of Canterbury, found it advisable—" "Found what?" said the Duck. "Found it," the Mouse replied rather crossly. "Of course you know what it means." "I know what it means well enough, when I find a thing," said the Duck. "It's generally a frog or a worm. The question is, what did the Archbishop find?" The Mouse did not notice this question, but hurriedly went on. "Found it advisable to go with Edgar Atheling to meet William and offer him the crown. William's conduct at first was moderate, but the insolence of his Normans— How are you getting on now, my dear?" it continued, turning to Alice as it spoke. "As wet as ever," said Alice in a melancholy tone. "It doesn't seem to dry me at all." "In that case," said the Dodo solemnly, rising to its feet, "I move that the meeting adjourn for the immediate adoption of more energetic remedies." "Speak English," said the Eaglet. "I don't know the meaning of half those long words, and what's more, I don't believe you do either." And the Eaglet bent down its head to hide a smile. Some of the other birds tittered audibly. "What I was going to say," said the Dodo, in an offended tone, "was that the best thing to get us dry would be a caucus-race." "What is a caucus-race?" said Alice. Not that she much wanted to know, but the Dodo had paused as if it thought that somebody ought to speak, and no one else seemed inclined to say anything. "Why," said the Dodo, "the best way to explain it is to do it. And as you might like to try the thing yourself some winter day, I will tell you how the Dodo managed it. First it marked out a racecourse, in a sort of circle. The exact shape doesn't matter, it said, and then all the party were placed along the course here and there. There was no 1, 2, 3 and away, but they began running when they liked, and left off when they liked, so that it was not easy to know when the race was over. However, when they had been running half an hour or so, and were quite dry again, the Dodo suddenly called out, 'The race is over!' And they all crowded around it, panting and asking, 'But who has won?' This question the Dodo could not answer without a great deal of thought, and it stood for a long time with one finger pressed upon its forehead, the position in which you usually see Shakespeare in the pictures of him. while the rest waited in silence. At last the Dodo said, "Everybody has won, and all must have prizes." "But who is to give the prizes?" quite a chorus of voices asked. "Why, she, of course," said the Dodo, pointing to Alice with one finger, and the whole party at once crowded around her, calling out in a confused way, "Prizes, prizes!" Alice had no idea what to do, and in despair she put her hand in her pocket and pulled out a box of comfits. Luckily the salt water had not got into it, and handed them around as prizes. There was exactly one apiece all round. "But she must have a prize herself, you know," said the Mouse. "Of course," said the Dodo. He replied very gravely. "What else have you got in your pocket?" "Only a thimble," said Alice sadly. "Hand it over here," said the Dodo. Then they all crowded round her at once more, while the Dodo solemnly presented the thimble, saying, "We beg your acceptance of this elegant thimble." And when it had finished this short speech, they all cheered. Poor girl. There's the lovely illustration. Alice thought the whole thing was very absurd, but they all looked so grave that she did not dare to laugh, and, as she could not think of anything to say, she simply bowed and took the thimble, looking as solemn as she could. The next thing was to eat the comfits. This caused some noise and confusion, as the large birds complained that they could not taste theirs, and the small ones choked and had to be patted on the back. However, it was over at last, and they sat down again in a ring and begged the Mouse to tell them something more. "You promised to tell me your history, you know," said Alice. "And why is it you hate C and D?" she added in a whisper, half afraid that it would be offended again. "Mine is a long and a sad tale," said the Mouse, turning to Alice and sighing. "It is a long tale, certainly," said Alice, looking down with wonder at the Mouse's tail. "But why do you call it sad?" And she kept on puzzling about it while the Mouse was speaking, so that her idea of the tale was something like this. "Fury said to a mouse that he met in the house, 'Let us both go to law. I will prosecute you. Come, I'll take no denial. We must have the trial, for really this morning I've nothing to do,' said the Mouse to the cur. 'Such a trial, dear sir, with no jury or judge, would be wasting our breath. I'll be judge, I'll be jury,' said cunning old Fury. 'I'll try the whole cause and condemn you to death.'" That is like going to the opticians. Trying to read that tiny little bit at the bottom. "You are not attending," said the Mouse to Alice severely. "What are you thinking of?" "I beg your pardon," said Alice very humbly. You had got to the fifth bend, I think." "I had not," cried the Mouse sharply and very angrily. "A not?" said Alice, always ready to make herself useful, and looking anxiously about her. "Oh, do let me help you undo it." "I shall do nothing of the sort," said the Mouse, getting up and walking away. "You insult me by talking such nonsense." "I didn't mean it," pleaded poor Alice. "But you're so easily offended, you know." The Mouse only growled in reply. "Please come back and finish your story." Alice called after it, and the others all joined in chorus. "Yes, please do." But the Mouse only shook its head impatiently and walked a little quicker. "What a pity it wouldn't stay," sighed the Lory, as soon as it was quite out of sight. And an old crab took the opportunity of saying to her daughter, "Ah, my dear, let this be a lesson to you, never to lose your temper." "Hold your tongue, Ma," said the young crab, a little snappishly. "You're enough to try the patience of an oyster." "I wish I had our Dinah here, I know I do," said Alice aloud, addressing nobody in particular. "She'd soon fetch it back." "And who is Dinah, if I might venture to ask the question?" said the Lory. Alice replied eagerly, for she was always ready to talk about her pet. "Dinah's our cat, and she's such a capital one for catching mice, you can't think. And oh, I wish you could see her after the birds. Why, she'll eat a little bird as soon as look at it." This speech caused a remarkable sensation among the party. Some of the birds hurried off at once. One old magpie began wrapping itself up very carefully, remarking, "I really must be getting home. The night air doesn't suit my throat." And a canary called out in a trembling voice to its children, "Come away, my dears. It's high time you were all in bed." On various pretexts they all moved off, and Alice was soon left alone. "I wish I hadn't mentioned Dinah," she said to herself in a melancholy tone. "Nobody seems to like her down here, and I'm sure she's the best cat in the world. Oh, my dear Dinah, I wonder if I shall ever see you any more." And here poor Alice began to cry again, for she felt very lonely and low-spirited. In a little while, however, she again heard a little pattering of footsteps in the distance, and she looked up eagerly, half hoping that the mouse had changed his mind and was coming back to finish his story. Chapter 4. The Rabbit Sends in a Little Bill. It was the White Rabbit trotting slowly back again, and looking anxiously about as it went, as if it had lost something, and she heard it muttering to itself, "The Duchess, the Duchess! Oh, my dear paws! Oh, my fur, my whiskers! She'll get me executed, as sure as ferrets are ferrets! Where can I have dropped them, I wonder?" Alice guessed in a moment that it was looking for the fan and the pair of white kid gloves, and she very good-naturedly began hunting about for them. But they were nowhere to be seen. Everything seemed to have changed since her swim in the pool, and the great hall, with the glass table and the little door, had vanished completely. Very soon the rabbit noticed Alice, as she went hunting about, and called out to her in an angry tone, "Why, Mary Ann, what are you doing out here? Run home this moment and fetch me a pair of gloves and a fan. Quick, now!" And Alice was so much frightened that she ran off at once in the direction it pointed to, without trying to explain the mistake that it had made. "He took me for his housemaid," she said to herself as she ran. "How surprised he'll be when he finds out who I am. But I'd never take him his fan and gloves, that is, if I can find them." As she said this, she came upon a neat little house, on the door of which was a bright brass plate with the name W. Rabbit engraved upon it. She went in without knocking, and hurried upstairs, in great fear lest she should meet the real Mary Ann, and be turned out of the house before she had found the fan and gloves. "How queer it seems," Alice said to herself, "to be going messages for a rabbit. I suppose Dinah will be sending me on messages next." And she began fancying the sort of thing that would happen. "Miss Alice, come here directly and get ready for your walk. Coming in a minute, nurse. But I've got to watch this mouse hole till Dinah comes back, and see that the mouse doesn't get out. Only I don't think," Alice went on, "that they'd let Dinah stop in the house if it began ordering people about like that." By this time she had found her way into a tidy little room with a table in the window, and on it, as she had hoped, a fan and 2 or 3 pairs of tiny white kid gloves. She took up the fan and a pair of the gloves, and was just going to leave the room when her eye fell upon a little bottle that stood near the looking-glass. There was no label this time with the words "Drink me," but nevertheless she uncorked it and put it to her lips. "I know something interesting is sure to happen," she said to herself, "whenever I eat or drink anything, so I'll just see what this little bottle does. I do hope it'll make me grow large again, for really I'm quite tired of being such a tiny little thing." It did so indeed, and much sooner than she had expected. Before she had drunk half the bottle, she found her head pressing against the ceiling, and had to stoop to save her neck from being broken. She hastily put down the bottle, saying to herself, "That's quite enough. I hope I shan't grow any more. As it is, I can't get out at the door. I do wish I hadn't drunk quite so much." Alas, it was too late to wish that. She went on growing, and very soon had to kneel down on the floor. In another minute there was not even room for this, and she tried the effect of lying down with one elbow against the door and the other arm curled around her head. Still, she went on growing, and as a last resort she put one arm out of the window and one foot up the chimney, and said to herself, "Now I can do no more. Whatever happens, what will become of me?" Luckily for Alice, the little magic bottle had now had its full effect, and she grew no larger. Still, it was very uncomfortable, and as there seemed to be no sort of chance of her ever getting out of the room again, no wonder she felt unhappy. It was much pleasanter at home, thought poor Alice, when one wasn't always growing larger and smaller, and being ordered about by mice and rabbits. I almost wish I hadn't gone down that rabbit hole, and yet, it's rather curious, you know, this sort of life. I do wonder what can have happened to me. When I used to read fairy tales, I fancied that kind of thing never happened, and now here I am, in the middle of one. There ought to be a book written about me, that there ought, and when I grow up, I'll write one. But I'm grown up now," she added in a sorrowful tone. "At least there's no room to grow any more here. But then," thought Alice, "shall I never get any older than I am now? That'll be a comfort. One way, never to be an old woman. But then, always to have lessons to learn. Oh, I shouldn't like that." "Oh, you foolish Alice," she answered herself. "How can you learn lessons in here? Why, there's hardly room for you, and no room at all for any lesson books." And so she went on, taking first one side and then the other, and making quite a conversation of it altogether. But after a few minutes she heard a voice outside and stopped to listen. "Mary-Ann, Mary-Ann," said the voice, "fetch me my gloves this moment." Then came a little pattering of feet on the stairs. Alice knew it was the rabbit coming back to look for her, and she trembled till she shook the house, quite forgetting that she was now about 1,000 times as large as the rabbit, and had no reason to be afraid of it. Presently the rabbit came up to the door and tried to open it, but as the door opened inwards, and Alice's elbow was pressed against it, that attempt proved a failure. Alice heard it say to itself, "Then I'll go round and get in at the window." That you won't do, thought Alice, and after waiting till she fancied she heard the rabbit just under the window, she suddenly spread out her hand and made a snatch in the air. She did not get hold of anything, but she heard a little shriek and a fall and a crash of broken glass, from which she concluded that it was just possible it had fallen into a cucumber frame or something of the sort. Next came an angry voice, the rabbit's, "Pat, Pat, where are you?" And then a voice she had never heard before, "Sure, then I'm here, digging for apples, your honour." "Digging for apples indeed," said the rabbit angrily. "Here, come and help me out of this." Sounds of more broken glass. "Now tell me, Pat, what's that in the window?" "Sure, it's an arm, your honour." "An arm, you goose? Who ever saw one that size? Why, it fills the whole window." "Sure it does, your honour, but it's an arm for all that." "Well, it's got no business there at any rate. Go and take it away." There was a long silence after this, and Alice could only hear whispers now and then, such as, "Sure, I don't like it, your honour, at all, at all." "Do as I tell you, you coward." And at last she spread out her hand again and made another snatch in the air. This time there were 2 little shrieks, and more sounds of broken glass. "What a number of cucumber frames there must be," thought Alice. "I wonder what they'll do next. As for pulling me out of the window, I only wish they could. I'm sure I don't want to stay in here any longer." She waited for some time without hearing anything more. At last came a rumbling of little cartwheels and the sound of a good many voices all talking together. She made out the words, "Where's the other ladder? Why, I hadn't to bring but one. Bill's got the other. Bill, fetch it here, lad. Here, put 'em up at this corner. No, tie 'em together first. They don't reach half high enough yet. Oh, they'll do well enough. Don't be particular. Here, Bill, catch hold of this rope. Will the roof bear? Mind that loose slate. Oh, it's coming down. Heads below." A loud crash. "Now who did that?" "It was Bill, I fancy." "Who's to go down the chimney?" "Nay, I shan't. You do it." "That I won't." "Then Bill's got to go down. Here, Bill, the master says you've got to go down the chimney." "Oh, so Bill's got to come down the chimney, has he?" said Alice to herself. "Why, they seem to put everything upon Bill. I wouldn't be in Bill's place for a good deal. This fireplace is narrow, to be sure, but I think I can kick a little." She drew her foot as far down the chimney as she could, and waited until she heard a little animal. She couldn't guess of what sort it was, scratching and scrambling about in the chimney, close above her, saying to herself, "This is Bill." She gave one sharp kick and waited to see what would happen next. The next thing she heard was a general chorus of, "There goes Bill." Then the rabbit's voice alone, "Catch him, you by the hedge." And then silence, and then another confusion of voices. "Hold up his head, brandy now." "Don't choke him." "How was it, old fellow? What happened to you? Tell us all about it." Last came a little feeble squeaking voice. "That's Bill," thought Alice. "Well, I hardly know. No more, thank you. I'm better now, but I'm a deal too flustered to tell you. All I know is something comes at me like a little jack-in-the-box, and up I goes like a sky-rocket." "So you did, old fellow," said the others. "We must burn the house down," said the rabbit's voice, and Alice called out as loud as she could, "If you do, I'll set Dinah on you." There was a dead silence instantly, and Alice thought to herself, "I wonder what they will do next. If they had any sense, they'd take the roof off." After a minute or two, they began moving about again, and Alice heard the rabbit say, "A barrowful will do to begin with." A barrowful of what? thought Alice, but she had not long to doubt, for the next moment a shower of little pebbles came rattling in at the window, and some of them hit her in the face. "I'll put a stop to this," she said to herself, and shouted out, "You'd better not do that again," which produced another dead silence. Alice noticed with some surprise that the pebbles were all turning into little cakes as they lay on the floor, and a bright idea came into her head. "If I eat one of these cakes, it's sure to make some change in my size, and as it can't possibly make me larger, it must make me smaller, I suppose." So she swallowed one of the cakes, and was delighted to find that she began shrinking directly. As soon as she was small enough to get through the door, she ran out of the house and found a quite found quite a crowd of little animals and birds waiting outside. The poor little lizard, Bill, was in the middle, being held up by 2 guinea pigs who were giving it something out of a bottle. They all made a rush at Alice the moment she appeared, but she ran off as hard as she could and soon found herself safe in a thick wood. "The first thing I've got to do," said Alice to herself as she wandered about the wood, "is to grow to my right size again, and the second thing is to find my way into that lovely garden. I think that will be the best plan." It sounded an excellent plan, no doubt, and very neatly and simply arranged. The only difficulty was that she had not the smallest idea of how to set about it, and, while she was peering about anxiously among the trees, a little sharp bark just over her head made her look up in a great hurry. An enormous puppy was looking down at her, with large round eyes, and feebly stretching out one paw, trying to touch her. "Poor little thing," said Alice in a coaxing tone, and she tried hard to whistle to it, but she was terribly frightened all the time, as she thought that it might be hungry, in which case it would be very likely to eat her up in spite of all of her coaxing. Hardly knowing what she did, she picked up a little bit of stick and held it out to the puppy, whereupon the puppy jumped into the air off all its feet at once, with a yelp of delight, and rushed at the stick and made believe to worry it. Then Alice dodged behind a great thistle to keep herself from being run over, and the moment she appeared on the other side, the puppy made another rush at the stick and tumbled head over heels in its hurry to get hold of it. Then Alice, thinking it was very likely having a game of play with a cart horse, and expecting every moment to be trampled under its feet, ran around the thistle again. Then the puppy began a series of short charges at the stick, running very little way forwards each time, and a long way back, and barking hoarsely all the while, till at last it sat down a good way off, panting, with its tongue hanging out of its mouth, and its great eyes half shut. This seemed to Alice a good opportunity for making her escape, so she set off at once, and ran till she was quite tired and out of breath, until the puppy's bark sounded quite faint in the distance. "And yet what a dear little puppy it was," said Alice, as she leant against a buttercup to rest herself, and fanned herself with one of the leaves. "I should have liked teaching it tricks very much, if I'd only been the right size to do it. Oh dear, I'd nearly forgotten that I've got to grow again. Let me see, how is it to be managed? I suppose I ought to eat or drink something or other. But the great question is, what?" The great question certainly was what. Alice looked all around her at the flowers and the blades of grass, but she could not see anything that looked the right thing to eat or drink under the circumstances. There was a large mushroom growing near her, about the same height as herself, and when she had looked under it, and on both sides of it, and behind it, it occurred to her that she might as well look and see what was on top of it. She stretched herself up on tiptoe, and peeped over the edge of the mushroom, and her eyes immediately met those of a large blue caterpillar that was sitting on the top with its arms folded, quietly smoking a long hookah, and taking not the smallest notice of her or of anything else. Here we go. Treated you to 2 chapters of this one today. But, yeah. Okay. So, back on Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. Okay, so we're on chapter 4, The Secret Workers. Okay. The next evening, Grandpa Joe went on with his story. "You see, Charlie," he said, "not so very long ago there used to be thousands of people working in Mr. Willy Wonka's factory. Then one day, all of a sudden, Mr. Wonka had to ask every single one of them to leave, to go home and never to come back." "But why?" asked Charlie. "Because of spies." "Spies?" "Yes. All the other chocolate makers, you see, had begun to grow jealous of the wonderful sweets that Mr. Wonka was making, and they started sending in spies to steal his secret recipes. The spies took jobs in the Wonka factory, pretending that they were ordinary workers, and while they were there, each one of them found out exactly how a certain special thing was made." "And did they go back to their own factories and tell?" asked Charlie. "They must have," answered Grandpa Joe, "because soon after that, Fickelgruber's factory started making an ice cream that would never melt, even in the hottest sun. Then Mr. Prodnose's factory came out with a chewing gum that never lost its flavour, however much you chewed it. And then Mr. Slugworth's factory began making sugar balloons that you could blow up to huge sizes before you popped them with a pin and gobbled them up. And so on, and so on. And Mr. Willy Wonka tore his beard and shouted, "This is terrible! I shall be ruined! There are spies everywhere! I shall have to close the factory!" "But he didn't do that," Charlie said. "Oh, yes, he did. He told all the workers that he was sorry, but they would have to go home. Then he shut the main gates and fastened them with a chain, and suddenly Wonka's giant chocolate factory became silent and deserted. The chimney stopped smoking, the machine stopped whirring, and from then on not a single chocolate or sweet was made, not a soul went in or out, and even Mr. Willy Wonka himself disappeared completely. Months and months went by. Grandpa Joe went on, but still the factory remained closed, and everybody said, "Poor Mr. Wonka, he was so nice, and he made such marvellous things, but he's finished now. It's all over." Then something astonishing happened. One day, early in the morning, thin columns of white smoke were seen to be coming out of the tops of the tall chimneys of the factory. People in the town stopped and stared. "What's going on?" they cried. "Someone's lit the furnaces. Mr. Wonka must be opening up again." They ran to the gates, expecting to see them wide open, and Mr. Wonka standing there to welcome his workers back. But no, the great iron gates were still locked and chained as securely as ever, and Mr. Wonka was nowhere to be seen. "But the factory is working," the people shouted. "Listen, you can hear the machines. They're all whirring again, and you can smell the smell of melting chocolate in the air." Grandpa Joe leaned forward and laid a long bony finger on Charlie's knee, and he said softly, "But most mysterious of all, Charlie, were the shadows in the windows of the factory. The people standing on the street outside could see small dark shadows moving about behind the frosted glass windows." "Shadows of whom?" said Charlie quickly. That's exactly what everybody else wanted to know. "The place is full of workers," the people shouted, "but nobody's gone in. The gates are locked. It's crazy. Nobody ever comes out either." But there was no question at all, said Grandpa Joe, that the factory was running, and it's gone on running ever since, for these last 10 years. What's more, the chocolates and sweets it's been turning out have become more fantastic and delicious all the time. And of course, now, when Mr. Wonka invents some new and wonderful sweet, neither Mr. Fickelgruber, nor Mr. Prodnose, nor Mr. Slugworth, nor anybody else is able to copy it. No spies can go into the factory to find out how it is made. "But, Grandpa, who is Mr. Wonka using to do all the work in the factory?" "Nobody knows, Charlie." "But that's absurd. Hasn't someone asked Mr. Wonka?" "Nobody sees him any more. He never comes out. The only things that come out of that place are chocolates and sweets. They come out through a special trapdoor in the wall, all packed and addressed, and they are picked up every day by post office trucks." "But, Grandpa, what sort of people are they that work in there?" "My dear boy," said Grandpa Joe, "that is one of the great mysteries of the chocolate-making world. We know only one thing about them. They are very small. The faint shadows that sometimes appear behind the windows, especially late at night when the lights are on, are those of tiny people no taller than my knee." "There aren't any such people," Charlie said. Just then, Mr. Bucket, Charlie's father, came into the room. He was home from the toothpaste factory, and he was waving an evening newspaper rather excitedly. "Have you heard the news?" he cried. He held up the paper so that they could see the huge headline, which said, "Wonka Factory to be opened at last to lucky few." Chapter 5. The Golden Tickets. "You mean people are actually going to be allowed to go inside the factory?" cried Grandpa Joe. "Read us what it says, quickly." "All right," said Mr. Bucket, smoothing out the newspaper. "Listen. Evening Bulletin. Mr. Willy Wonka, the confectionery genius whom nobody has seen for the last 10 years, sent out the following notice today. I, Willy Wonka, have decided to allow 5 children, just 5, mind you, and no more, to visit my factory this year. These lucky 5 will be shown around personally by me, and they will be allowed to see all the secrets and the magic of my factory. Then, at the end of the tour, as a special present, all of them will be given enough chocolates and sweets to last them for the rest of their lives. So watch out for the golden tickets. 5 tickets have been printed on golden paper, and these 5 golden tickets have been hidden underneath the ordinary wrapping paper of 5 ordinary bars of chocolate. These 5 chocolate bars may be anywhere, in any shop, in any street, in any town, in any country in the world." upon any counter where Wonka's sweets are sold, and the 5 lucky finders of these 5 golden tickets are the only ones who will be allowed to visit my factory and see what it's like now inside. Good luck to you all, and happy hunting." "The man's dotty," muttered Grandma Josephine. "He's brilliant," cried Grandpa Joe. "He's a magician. Just imagine what will happen now. The whole world will be searching for those golden tickets. Everyone will be buying Wonka's chocolate bars in the hope of finding one. He'll sell more than ever before. Oh, how exciting it would be to find one." "And all the chocolate and sweets you could eat for the rest of your life, free?" said Grandma George. "Just imagine that. They'd have to deliver them in a truck." "It makes me quite ill to think of it," said Grandma Josephine. "Nonsense," cried Grandpa Joe. "Wouldn't it be something, Charlie, to open a bar of chocolate and see a golden ticket just glistening inside?" "It certainly would, Grandpa. But there isn't a hope," said Charlie sadly. "I only get 1 bar a year." "You never know, darling. It's your birthday next week. You have as much chance as anybody else." "I'm afraid that simply isn't true," said Grandpa George. "The kids who are going to find the golden tickets are the ones who can afford to buy bars of chocolate every day. Our Charlie only gets 1 a year. There isn't a hope." The first 2 finders. The very next day the first golden ticket was found. The finder was a boy called Augustus Gloop, and Mr. Bucket's evening newspaper carried a large picture of him on the front page. The picture showed a 9-year-old boy who was so enormously fat he looked as though he'd been blown up with a powerful pump. Great flabby folds of fat bulged out from every part of his body, and his face was like a monstrous ball of dough with 2 small greedy curranty eyes peering out upon the world. The town in which Augustus Gloop lived, the newspaper said, had gone wild with excitement over their hero. Flags were flying from all the windows, children had been given a holiday from school, and a parade was being organised in honour of the famous youth. "I just knew Augustus would find a golden ticket," his mother had told the paperman. He eats so many bars of chocolate a day that it was almost impossible for him not to find one. Eating is his hobby, you know. That's all he's interested in. But still, that's better than being a hooligan and shooting off zip guns and things like that in his spare time, isn't it? And what I always say is, he wouldn't go on eating like he does unless he needed nourishment, would he? It's all vitamins anyway. What a thrill it will be for him to visit Mr. Wonka's marvellous factory. We're just as proud as anything." "What a revolting woman," said Grandma Josephine. "And what a repulsive boy. Only 4 golden tickets left. I wonder who'll get those." And now the whole country, indeed the whole world, seemed suddenly to be caught up in a mad chocolate-buying spree. Everybody searching frantically for those precious remaining tickets. Fully grown women were seen going into sweet shops and buying 10 Wonka bars at a time, then tearing off the wrappers on the spot and peering eagerly underneath for a glint of golden paper. Children were taking hammers and smashing their piggy banks and running out to the shops with handfuls of money. In one city, a famous gangster robbed a bank of £1,000 and spent the whole lot on Wonka bars that same afternoon. And when the police entered his house to arrest him, they found him sitting on the floor amidst mountains of chocolate, ripping off the wrappers with the blade of a long dagger. In far-off Russia, a woman called Charlotte Rousset claimed to have found the second ticket, but it turned out to be a clever fake. The famous English scientist, Professor Folbody, invented a machine which would tell you at once, without opening the wrapper of a bar of chocolate, whether or not there was a golden ticket hidden underneath it. The machine had a mechanical arm that shot out with tremendous force and grabbed hold of anything that had the slightest bit of gold inside it, and for a moment it looked like the answer to everything. But unfortunately, while the professor was showing off the machine to the public at the sweet counter of a large department store, the mechanical arm shot out and made a grab for the gold filling in the back tooth for Duchess, who was standing nearby. There was an ugly scene, and the machine was smashed by the crowd. Suddenly, on the day before Charlie Bucket's birthday, the newspapers announced that the second golden ticket had been found. The lucky person was a small girl called Veruca Salt, who lived with her rich parents in a great city far away. Once again, Mr. Bucket's evening newspaper carried a big picture on the finder. She was sitting between her beaming father and mother in the living room of their house, waving the golden ticket above her head and grinning from ear to ear. Veruca's father, Mr. Salt, had eagerly explained to the newspaper men exactly how the ticket was found. "You see, boys," he said, "as soon as my little girl told me that she simply had to have one of these golden tickets, I went out into the town and started buying up all the Wonka bars I could lay my hands on. Thousands of them. I must have bought hundreds of thousands. Then I had them loaded onto trucks and sent directly to my own factory. I'm in the peanut business, you see, And I've got about 100 women working for me over my place, shelling peanuts for roasting and salting. That's what they do all day long. Those women, they sit there shelling peanuts. So I says to them, "OK, girls," I says, "from now on you can stop shelling peanuts and start shelling the wrappers of these chocolate bars instead." And they did. I had every worker in the place yanking the paper of those bars of chocolate, full speed, ahead from morning till night. But 3 days went by, and we had no luck. Oh, it was terrible. My little Veruca got more and more upset each day, and every time I went home she would scream at me, "Where's my golden ticket? I want my golden ticket!" And she would lie for hours on the floor, kicking and yelling in the most disturbing way. Well, I just hated to see my little girl feeling unhappy like that, so I vowed I would keep up the search until I'd got her what she wanted. Then suddenly, on the evening of the 4th day, one of my women workers yelled, "I've got it! A golden ticket!" And as I said, "Give it to me quick," she said, and I rushed it home and gave it to my darling Veruca. And now she's all smiles, and we have a very happy home once again. "That's even worse than the fat boy," said Grandma Josephine. "She needs a really good spanking," said Grandma Georgina. "I don't think the girl's father played it quite fair, Grandpa, do you?" Charlie murmured. "He spoils her, and no good can ever come from spoiling a child like that, Charlie, you mark my words." "Come to bed, my darling," said Charlie's mother. "Tomorrow's your birthday, don't forget that, so I expect you'll be up early to open your present." "A Wonka chocolate bar?" cried Charlie. "It is a Wonka bar, isn't it?" "Yes, my love, of course it is." "Oh, wouldn't it be wonderful if I found the 3rd golden ticket inside?" "Bring it in here when you get it," Grandpa Joe said. "Then we can all watch you taking off the wrapper." Right. Charlie's birthday. "Happy birthday, Charlie," cried the 4 old grandparents as Charlie came into their room early the next day. Charlie smiled nervously and sat down on the edge of the bed. He was holding his present, his only present, very carefully in his 2 hands. "Wonka's Whipple Scrumptious Fudge Mallow Delight," it said on the wrapper. The 4 old people, 2 at either end of the bed, propped themselves up on their pillows and stared with anxious eyes at the bar of chocolate in Charlie's hands. Mr. and Mrs. Bucket came in and stood at the foot of the bed, watching Charlie. The room became silent. Everybody was waiting now for Charlie to start opening his present. Charlie looked down at the bar of chocolate. He ran his fingers slowly back and forth along the length of it, stroking it lovingly, and the shiny paper wrapper made little sharp crackly noises in the quiet room. Then Mrs. Bucket said gently, "You mustn't be too disappointed, my darling, if you don't find what you're looking for underneath that wrapper. You really can't expect to be as lucky as all that." "She's quite right," Mr. Bucket said. Charlie didn't say anything. "After all," Grandma Josephine said, "in the whole wide world there are only 3 tickets left to be found. The thing to remember is that whatever happens, you'll still have the bar of chocolate. Wonka's Whipple Scrumptious Fudge Mallow Delight. It's the best of them all. You'll just love it." "Yes," Charlie whispered. "I know." "Just forget all about those golden tickets and enjoy the chocolate. Why don't you do that?" They all knew it was ridiculous to expect this one poor little bar of chocolate to have a magic ticket inside, and they were trying as gently and as kindly as they could to prepare Charlie for the disappointment. But there was one other thing that the grown-ups also knew, and it was this, that however small the chance might be of striking lucky, the chance was there. This particular bar of chocolate had as much chance as any other of having a golden ticket, and that was why all of the grandparents and parents in the room were actually just as tense and excited as Charlie was, although they were pretending to be very calm. "You'd better go ahead and open it, or you'll be late for school." "You might as well get it over with," said Grandpa Joe. "Open it, my dear. Please open it. You're making me jumpy." Very slowly, Charlie's fingers began to tear open one small corner of the wrapping paper. The old people in the bed all leaned forward, craning their scraggy necks. Then suddenly, as though he couldn't bear the suspense any longer, Charlie tore the wrapper right down the middle, and onto his lap there fell a light brown, creamy-coloured bar of chocolate. There was no sign of a golden ticket anywhere. "Well, that's that," said Grandpa Joe brightly. "Just what we expected." Charlie looked up. 4 kind old faces were watching him intently from the bed. He smiled at them, a small sad smile, and then he shrugged his shoulders and picked up the chocolate bar and held it out to his mother and said, "Here, Mother, have a bit. We'll share it. I want everybody to taste it." "Certainly not," said his mother, and the others all cried, "No, no, we couldn't dream of it. It's all yours." "Please," begged Charlie, turning round and offering it to Grandpa Joe, but neither he nor anyone else would take any of it. "It's time to go to school, my darling," Mrs. Bucket said, putting an arm round Charlie's skinny shoulders. "Come on, or you'll be late." point, just pause that one. Okay. So we're on to the final book again. Winnie the Pooh. Let's take this one again. Okay. Okay. So we're on to chapter 3 on this one, in which Pooh and Piglet go hunting and nearly catch a woozle. The Piglet lived in a very grand house in the middle of a beech tree, and the beech tree was in the middle of the forest, and the Piglet lived in the middle of the house. Next to his house was a piece of broken board which had "Trespassers were" on it. When Christopher Robin asked the Piglet what it meant, he said it was his grandfather's name, and had been in the family for a long time. Christopher Robin said, "You couldn't be called Trespassers W." And Piglet said, "Yes, you could, because his grandfather was, and it was short for Trespassers Will, which was short for Trespassers William, and his grandfather had had 2 names in case he lost one. Trespassers after an uncle, and William after Trespassers. "I've got 2 names," said Christopher Robin carelessly. "Well, there you are. That proves it," said Piglet. One fine winter's day, when Piglet was brushing away with the snow in front of his house, he happened to look up, and there was Winnie the Pooh. Pooh was walking around and round in a circle, thinking of something else, and when Piglet called to him, he just went on walking. "Hello," said Piglet. "What are you doing?" "Hunting," said Pooh. "Hunting what?" "Tracking something," said Winnie the Pooh, very mysteriously. "Tracking what?" said Piglet, coming closer. "That's just what I asked myself. What? What do you think you'll answer?" "I shall have to wait until I catch up with it," said Winnie the Pooh. "Now, look there." He pointed to the ground in front of him. "What do you see there?" "Tracks," said Piglet. "Paw marks." He gave a little squeak of excitement. "Oh, Pooh, do you think it's a woozle?" "It may be," said Pooh. "Sometimes it is, and sometimes it isn't. You never can tell with paw marks." With these few words he went on tracking, and Piglet, after watching him for a minute or 2, ran after him. Winnie the Pooh had come to a sudden stop and was bending over the tracks in a puzzled sort of way. "What's the matter?" asked Piglet. "It's a very funny thing," said Bear, "but there seem to be 2 animals now. This, whatever it was, has been joined by another, whatever it is, and the 2 of them are now proceeding in company. Would you mind coming with me, Piglet, in case they turn out to be hostile animals?" Piglet scratched his ear in a nice sort of way, and said that he had nothing to do until Friday, and would be delighted to come, in case it really was a woozle. "You mean, in case it really is 2 woozles?" said Winnie the Pooh, and Piglet said that anyhow he had nothing to do until Friday. So off they went together. There was a small spinney of larch trees just here, and it seemed as if 2 woozles, if that is what they were, had been going around the spinney. So round this spinney went Pooh and Piglet after them, Piglet passing the time by telling Pooh what his grandfather Trespassers W had done to remove stiffness after tracking, and how his grandfather Trespasser W had suffered in his later years from shortness of breath and other matters of interest, and Pooh wondering what a grandfather was like, and if perhaps this was 2 grandfathers they were after now, and if so, whether he'd be allowed to take one home and keep it, and what Christopher Robin would say. And still the tracks went on in front of them. Suddenly Winnie the Pooh stopped and pointed excitedly in front of him. "Look!" "What?" said Piglet, with a jump, and then to show that he hadn't been frightened, he jumped up and down once or twice more, in an exercising sort of way. "The tracks," said Pooh. "A 3rd animal has joined the other 2. "Pooh," cried Piglet, "do you think it is another woozle?" "No, because it makes different marks. It is either 2 woozles and 1, as it might be Whizzle, or 2, as it might be Whizzles, and 1, if so it is a woozle. Let us continue to follow them." So they went on, feeling just a little anxious now, in case the 3 animals in front of them were of hostile intent, and Piglet wished very much that his grandfather T.W. were there, instead of elsewhere, and Pooh thought how nice it would be if he met Christopher Robin suddenly, but quite accidentally, and only because he liked Christopher Robin so much. And then, all of a sudden, Winnie the Pooh stopped again, and licked the tip of his nose in a cooling manner, for he was feeling more hot and anxious than ever in his life before. There were 4 animals in front of them. Do you see, Piglet? Look at their tracks. 3, as it were, woozles, and 1, as it was, a weasel. Another woozle has joined them. And so it seemed to be. There were the tracks, crossing over each other here, getting muddled up with each other there. But, quite plainly, every now and then, the tracks of 4 sets of paws. I think, said Piglet, when he licked the tip of his nose too, and found that it brought very little comfort, I think that I've just remembered something. I have just remembered something that I forgot to do yesterday, and shan't be able to do tomorrow. So I suppose I really ought to go back and do it now. We'll do it this afternoon, and I'll come with you, said Pooh. It isn't the sort of thing you can do in the afternoon, said Piglet quickly. It's a very particular morning thing that has to be done in the morning, and, if possible, between the hours of... What would you say the time was? About 12, said Winnie the Pooh, looking at the sun. Between, as I was saying, the hours of 12 and 12:05. So, really, dear old Pooh, if you'll excuse me... What's that? Pooh looked up at the sky, and then, as he heard the whistle again, he looked up into the branches of a big oak tree, and there he saw his friend. It's Christopher Robin, he said. Ah, then you'll be all right, said Piglet. You'll be quite safe with him. Goodbye. And he trotted off home as quickly as he could, very glad to be out of all the danger again. Christopher Robin came slowly down his tree. Silly old bear, he said, what were you doing? First you went round the spinney twice by yourself, and then Piglet ran after you, and you went round again together, and then you were just going round and round. Wait a moment, said Winnie the Pooh, holding up his paw. He sat down and thought in the most thoughtful way that he could think. Then he fitted his paw into one of the tracks, and then he scratched his nose twice and stood up. Yes, said Winnie the Pooh, I see now. I've been foolish and deluded, and I'm a bear of no brain at all. You're the best bear in the world, said Christopher Robin soothingly. Am I? And then he brightened up suddenly. Anyhow, he said, it's nearly luncheon time. So he went home for it. That's a really cute story. And what's the next one? Let's read the next one. It's not too long. In which Eeyore loses a tail and Pooh finds one. The old grey donkey Eeyore stood by himself in a thistly corner of the forest, his front feet well apart, his head on one side, and thought about things. Sometimes he thought sadly to himself, why? And sometimes he thought, wherefore? And sometimes he thought, inasmuch as which? And sometimes he didn't quite know what he was thinking about. So when Winnie the Pooh came stumping along, Eeyore was very glad to be able to stop thinking for a little in order to say, how do you do? In a gloomy manner to him. And how are you? Said Winnie the Pooh. Eeyore shook his head from side to side. Not very how. I don't seem to have felt at all how for a very long time. Dear, dear, said Pooh. I'm sorry about that. Let's have a look at you. So Eeyore stood there, gazing sadly at the ground, and Winnie the Pooh walked all around him once. Why, what's happened to your tail? He said in surprise. What has happened to it? Said Eeyore. It isn't there. Are you sure? Well, either a tail is there or it isn't there. You can't make a mistake about it, and yours isn't there. Then what is? Nothing. Let's have a look, said Eeyore, and he turned slowly round to the place where his tail had been a little while ago, and then, finding that he couldn't catch it up, he turned around the other way, until he came back to where he was at first, and then he put his head down and looked between his front legs, and at last he said, with a long, sad sigh, I believe you're right. Of course I'm right, said Pooh. That accounts for a good deal, said Eeyore gloomily. It explains everything. No wonder. You must have left it somewhere, said Winnie. Somebody must have taken it, said Eeyore. How like them, he added after a long silence. Pooh felt that he ought to say something helpful about it, but didn't quite know what, so he decided to do something helpful instead. Eeyore, he said solemnly, I, Winnie the Pooh, will find your tail for you. Thank you, Pooh. You're a real friend, he said. Not like some, he said. So Winnie the Pooh went off to find Eeyore's tail. It was a fine spring morning in the forest as he started out. Little soft clouds played happily in a blue sky, skipping from time to time in front of the sun, as if they had to put it out, and then sliding suddenly so that the next might have his turn. Through them and between them the sun shone bravely, and a copse, which had worn its furs all the year round, seemed old and dowdy now beside the new green lace which the beeches had put on so prettily. Through copse and spinney marched Bear, down open slopes of gorse and heather, over rocky beds of streams, up steep banks of sandstone into the heather again, and so at last, tired and hungry, to the 100-acre wood. For it was in the 100-acre wood that Owl lived. And if anyone knows anything about anything, said Bear to himself, it's Owl who knows something about something. Or my name's not Winnie the Pooh, which it is, so there you are. Owl lived at the Chestnuts, an old-world residence of great charm, which was grander than anybody else's, or seemed so to Bear, because it had both a knocker and a bell pull. Underneath the knocker there was a notice which said, Please ring if an answer is required. Underneath the bell pull there was a notice which said, Please knock if an answer is not required. These notices had been written by Christopher Robin, who was the only one in the forest who could spell. For Owl, wise though he was in many years, able to read and write and spell his own name well, yet somehow went all to pieces over delicate words like measles and buttered toast. Winnie the Pooh read the two notices very carefully, first from left to right, and afterwards, in case he had missed some of it, from right to left. Then, to make quite sure, he knocked and pulled the knocker. He pulled and knocked the bell rope, and then he called out in a very loud voice, Owl, I require an answer. It's Bear speaking. And the door opened, and Owl looked out. Hello, Pooh. How's things? Terrible and sad, because Eeyore, who is a friend of mine, has lost his tail. And he's moping about, so could you very kindly tell me how to find it for him? Well, said Owl, the customary procedure in such cases is as follows. What does customary proceed cake mean? Said Pooh, for I am a bear of very little brain, and long words bother me. It means the thing to do. As long as it means that, I don't mind, said Pooh. The thing to do is as follows. First, issue a reward. Then, just a moment, said Pooh, holding up his paw. What do we do to this? What you were saying? You sneezed just as you were going to tell me. I didn't sneeze. Yes, you did, Owl. Excuse me, Pooh, I didn't. You can't sneeze without knowing it. Well, you can't know it without something having been sneezed. What I said was, first issue a reward. You're doing it again, said Pooh sadly. A reward, said Owl very loudly. We write a notice to say that you will give a large something to anybody who finds Eeyore's tail. I see. Talking about large somethings, he went on dreamily, I generally have a small something about this time in the morning. And he looked wistfully at the cupboard in the corner of Owl's parlour, just a mouthful of condensed milk, or what not, which, with perhaps a lick of honey. Well, then, we write out his notice, and we put it up all over the forest. A lick of honey? Murmured Bear to himself, or not, as the case may be. And he gave a deep sigh, and tried very hard to listen to what Owl was saying. But Owl went on and on, using longer and longer words, until at last he came back to where he started, and he explained that the person to write about this notice was Christopher Robin. It was he who wrote the ones on my front door for me. Did you see them, Pooh? For some time now Pooh had been saying yes and no, in turn with his eyes shut to all that Owl was saying, and having said yes, last time he said no, not at all, now without really knowing what Owl was talking about. Didn't you see them? Said Owl, a little surprised. Come and look at them now. So they went outside, and Pooh looked at the knocker and the notice below it, and he looked at the bell rope, and the notice below it, and the more he looked at the bell rope, the more he felt that he had seen something like it somewhere else, some time before. Handsome bell rope, isn't it? Said Owl. Pooh nodded. It reminds me of something, but I can't think what. Where did you get it? I just came across it in the forest. It was hanging over a bush, and I thought at first somebody lived there, so I rang it. Nothing happened, and then I rang it again, very loudly, and it came up in my hand. And as nobody seemed to want it, I took it home, and... Ow, said Pooh solemnly, you made a mistake. Somebody did want it. Who? Eeyore, my dear friend Eeyore. He was fond of it. Fond of it? Attached to it, said Pooh sadly. So with these words he unhooked it and carried it back to Eeyore, and when Christopher Robin had nailed it on in its right place again, Eeyore frisked about the forest, waving his tail so happily that Winnie the Pooh came over all funny, and had to hurry home for a little snack of something to sustain him. And wiping his mouth half an hour afterwards, he sang to himself proudly, Who found the tail? I, said Pooh, at 11:45, only it was 11:45 really. I found the tail. Oh, so sweet. Okay, just put the cover back on that one. Okay, so it's been lovely reading with you, and I hope you've enjoyed the next few chapters of each. And I'll see you again soon for the next parts if you're interested. Okay?